Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and joining us on this Friday morning. I really enjoyed reading your introductions and learning about things that have brought you joy this week. Please continue to do that as more folks are joining. My name is Brennison Wheeler. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Community Education and Outreach Manager at Women's Advocates, which is a nonprofit organization located in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we offer a continuum of safety. So through our prevention programming, like webinars such as these, emergency shelter services, and aftercare housing support for victims, survivors of domestic violence. We also encourage you to take care of yourselves however you need during this webinar. As a reminder, we will be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the recording of the webinar, a PDF of the PowerPoint slides, and information on how to receive a certificate of attendance if that's something you are interested in. Another reminder is that this is a webinar, which means that attendees' videos and microphones are automatically turned off, so no one can hear or see the attendees. You are welcome to submit any questions using the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. We'll also have many opportunities for engagement in the chat. And you might see a text running at the bottom of your screen. These are closed captions. If they're distracting or you don't want them on for any reason or you can't see the slides because of it, you can click on the live transcript button and press hide subtitles. So that feature will, and you can turn them back on at any time. And then before we officially dive into today's webinar, I want to acknowledge and extend gratitude for our American Sign Language or ASL interpreters, Scotty and Jen, and also Meggie Royer from Violence Free Minnesota. You're welcome to introduce yourself at this time if you'd like.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Meggie Royer. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Youth and Prevention Program Manager at Violence Free Minnesota. We are the statewide domestic violence coalition of Minnesota, and I'm looking forward to being with you all today.
Great, thank you so much. So today's topic is healing through safe connections, and we're going to expand a little bit more on what that means, of course. But before we do, we'll just do a brief introduction of our respective organizations. So I know Meggie kind of just mentioned this about Violence Free Minnesota, and I kind of gave a little synopsis about our organization too at Women's Advocates. But I'll just kind of state our mission, which is to walk with victim survivors and our community to break the cycle of domestic violence. So the intergenerational cycle and also the within a relationship cycle of domestic violence as well. And so you can kind of see our continuum of safety, and we're very kind of emphasizing generational healing and safety in the way that we're approaching our advocacy at the shelter. Fun fact is that we are one of the first domestic violence shelters in the United States. So a lot of great work on supporting victim survivors and holding people who use abuse accountable has happened in the state of Minnesota and also Duluth, which is a part of Minnesota. So I'll just hand it over to Meggie to talk a little bit more about Violence Free Minnesota.
Thanks, Brennison. So as I mentioned, Violence Free Minnesota is the statewide domestic violence coalition in Minnesota, which means that we're actually a member-based agency. So we have about 90 member agencies across the entire state who are working to represent victim survivors, challenge systems and institutions, promote social change, and support, educate, and connect member programs. So a pretty significant percentage of our member agencies in Minnesota provide some sort of direct services to victim survivors of domestic violence. Some of them also provide services to sexual violence survivors. And you'll see our website link at the bottom of the screen if you want to learn more about Violence Free Minnesota.
So now that you know a little bit more about us, we would love to know more about you and kind of have a better understanding of who is on the call today. So I just launched a poll, so if you could take a quick second to select the category that best identifies your role in the community or why you're attending this webinar. I know a lot of us wear a lot of different hats too, so you actually might identify with a lot of different categories. If you don't see your sector represented in this poll, we welcome you to add it to the chat. But I'm going to give just 30 more seconds to fill that poll out. In the meantime, you can take a look at what we have in store for the next 90 minutes or so. We're kind of splitting the presentation up into 4 different parts. And so we'll first kind of start about this shift from trauma-informed to healing-centered engagement. And then we'll talk more about survivors of trauma and their reactions that may play out in settings in different capacities, whether that's physically, emotionally, behaviorally. And then we'll move to kind of more the application part of the webinar, where we're identifying strategies for creating this welcoming, warm environment that's conducive to healing, and also ways to foster this collaborative, empowering professional relationship with survivors. And if you are a survivor yourself attending this might give you some ideas of things to talk about with professionals who are supporting you. So I'm going to go ahead and end this poll and share the results. So it looks like 73% of those who filled out the poll identify with human services, victim service provider, child care provider, and then we have 10% identifying as a mental health professional, 7% as an employer, as someone who works at a workplace, and then a couple other who are victim survivors themselves, who are in the medical field or legal housing orienting field as well. So thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to have you. We're going to transition to the first part of this webinar, which has another corresponding poll. So this question is, have you ever heard of the term trauma-informed care? Okay, I'll give about 10 more seconds before I close this poll. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end it. So it looks like 89% of those who filled out the poll said that they have heard of the term trauma-informed care, and 11% said no, they have not heard of the term trauma-informed care. So we have one more quick follow-up before we launch into this first section. Have you ever heard of the term healing-centered engagement? So again, I'll give about 30 seconds here. All right. So it looks like 80% said no, they have not heard of the term healing-centered engagement, and 20% said yes, they have. So that's really great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'll turn it over to Meggie to talk a little bit more about healing-centered engagement.
Thank you, Brennison. So I'm not surprised that not many people have heard of the term healing-centered engagement, because it's actually quite a new term, but did want to acknowledge the person who actually came up with the term and the concept. So healing-centered engagement was created by Dr. Sean Ginwright, who's a professor, researcher, and activist who focuses a lot on youth activism, African-American youth, and youth development. And he actually coined this term only about 3 years ago in 2018. It's really a strengths-based, culturally rooted approach to wellness. And we'll talk in the next slide about really what are the differences between trauma-informed care and healing-centered engagement, because it really is a pretty big shift to go from trauma-informed to being healing-centered. So when we think about trauma-informed care, a lot of times it's really focused on individual trauma. It's more about resiliency and recovery and understanding trauma and how to respond to it. And then we know that there are a lot of different principles involved in trauma-informed care. Some of you may have heard of them, but some of the more common ones are safety and stability, collaboration and empowerment, helping people who've experienced trauma regain some of that power and have a choice and a voice in what happens next in their lives. However, trauma-informed care is really kind of more this clinical approach where it is sometimes looking at trauma in terms of symptoms and how do you respond to that in a helping capacity. And it also really asks what happened to you or what was done to you. So trying to really understand how trauma is impacting individuals and how those impacts might play out in different settings in that person's life. Whereas when we think about healing-centered engagement, it's not a focus on the individual, it's actually a collective focus. So it's really acknowledging that entire neighborhoods or families or entire communities can experience collective trauma, and they can also heal collectively together as well. So it's more of a holistic view of trauma and resiliency. So healing-centered is focused, just like the title says, on healing. It's viewing individuals who've experienced trauma as agents in their own well-being. So again, it's kind of that empowerment piece, and it's really strengths-based. It doesn't take a deficit approach. It also really addresses the root causes of harm, whereas trauma-informed care is sometimes more about responding to what has caused the harm. It's not necessarily looking at what are the roots of that trauma. So when we think about healing-centered engagement, it really is more political and clinical. A lot of times it's looking at situations of collective trauma, like institutionalized racism, genocide, and really focusing on how that might affect an entire community and traumatize an entire community. So healing-centered engagement versus asking what's happened to you and just ending there actually asks what's right with you. What are the ways in which you're resilient when you're responding to trauma? So again, it's really that strengths-based approach versus a deficit approach. So we do have a word cloud that we would hope that some of you would participate in, and this is through Menti. So we're just asking, what does the word healing mean to you? And there's really no right or wrong answer here, just whatever comes to mind when you hear the word healing. And so Brennison put the link in the chat. If you click on that link and use the code listed on the slide, which is 39594168, you can enter what healing means to you, or you can scan the QR code on the slide. So we'll just take a couple of minutes for that. So we're starting to see quite a few words coming in. The interesting thing about Menti and this kind of word cloud is that the bigger the word is, the more people have entered that word. So you can kind of see which words more people are thinking of. So I'm seeing moving forward, safety, recovery. Those are words that multiple people are entering in the word cloud.
I'm also noticing, oh, sorry, Meggie.
No, go ahead, Brennison.
I was going to say peace is growing in size. Peace, bigger peace, inner peace, hope, hopeful, moving forward, overcoming, resilient, wholeness, growing.
Nourish, I'm seeing nourish, resiliency. So a lot of those really are pieces of healing-centered engagement.
I see alive. That one stood out to me.
Fresh start, security, independence, right?
Absolutely.
I saw someone put skiing. I really like that. Just acknowledging that all of us have different ways of healing and what that looks like for us. Well, it looks like peace is kind of the overall concept that's coming to a lot of people's minds, but I think that an activity like this is really important because it just shows that all of us really have these different individual definitions of healing, but we also kind of have more of a collective definition, and that's really about that peace and recovery and safety. So thank you so much, everyone, for contributing to the word cloud. And this is really just kind of a visual diagram that depicts some of the things I just mentioned that are components of healing, a healing-centered approach. So as I mentioned, it's really engaging people as agents of their own well-being, which I think is really important because if you're in some sort of helping relationship where if you're a victim services provider, if you're a therapist, if you're a social worker, which a lot of you in the poll earlier said that you were, sometimes it might be easy to kind of view yourself as the person who can heal the client. And we know that that's not the case. It's really the client or the patient or the survivor that you're working with who is really the agent in determining their own well-being and healing. And again, this approach is really about asking what's right with you versus what happened to you. So really building on the traits that the survivor already possesses, building on their experiences, their knowledge, their skills as positive traits, taking that strengths-based approach versus looking at what's wrong with you. And so in the chat, we have this at the bottom of the slide. We'd be interested in learning more about what some of you think a healing-centered approach might look like in your helping profession. Even if you can just think of one behavior in your helping profession that you would consider to be healing-centered. So we'll take a couple of minutes in the chat. So I'm seeing listening, meditation and journaling. A couple of people actually said listening. The sanctuary model where the client leads. That's interesting. I haven't heard of that. Breathing. We actually talk about breathing a little bit later as one component of healing-centered engagement. Another listening, focusing on positive aspects of the client's life, right? Active listening, providing resources. In shelter or in support groups, being healing and centered might look like congratulating or acknowledging that simply showing up is courageous and an important step, right? Leaving space, simply being there, using research to inform change, right? Requires follow-up. I like this one, asking what the victim needs and building a plan around their needs rather than what you think they need. And that's exactly right. That's healing-centered engagement. So thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. I think I saw the word listening probably about 5 or 6 times. So that really resonated with a lot of people. And I think that's what a lot of helping professionals might hear, that you should listen more than you speak, that it's really about putting the focus on that survivor and letting them share what they're comfortable sharing. Right. And also asking them, how can I help? What would you like to focus on today? So asking for that permission, and again, letting them be the agent of their own well-being. Thank you, everyone.
I saw someone raise their hand. If you would like to be unmuted, please let us know in the chat. I know sometimes raising the hand can be an accident. So you can let us know in the chat if you would like to be unmuted or if you would like to submit your question or comments in the chat. So we'll kind of put that out there. Oh, it was an accident. Okay, no worries. Thank you. Just wanted to make sure that you were heard if you would like to be.
So when we say trauma, trauma can mean many, many different things. And I think something that's important to note is that trauma is not an event, it's someone's response to the event. So it's more of an emotional response. So some people might consider, let's say, some sort of accident, let's say a car accident, to be a trauma. It's really more about how that person responds to that event, what's happening in their body, what's happening to their mind. So at the top of the slide, we just have some examples of different situations or forms of violence or abuse that could potentially lead to trauma for some individuals. But we also need to acknowledge that there are people who experience things like domestic violence in ways that are different from someone else. Everybody's trauma response looks different. So some events that might be traumatic to individuals could be intimate partner violence, medical trauma, community violence, disasters, whether those are natural disasters or they're human caused, which also I think for me brings to mind the pandemic, has really been for a lot of people a collective trauma in the past 1.5 years. Sexual assault, racial trauma, adverse childhood events, historical and intergenerational trauma. So really looking at these really complex, long-lasting issues like slavery, genocide, colonialism. And then we also have grief. And acknowledging that grief is not just about losing a loved one or someone dying, it can also be related to the end of a relationship or experiencing abuse from someone that you care about and that you love. And when we think about trauma, we also think about different kinds of trauma. So acute trauma is really resulting from a single incident. So like I mentioned, maybe a car accident. Whereas chronic trauma is really repeated and prolonged. It's something that you're experiencing over and over again over a period of time. So domestic violence, for example, because we know that domestic violence is often a pattern that really escalates over time. And then complex trauma. Some of you may have heard of complex PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. That's really when someone is having exposure to multiple varied traumatic events, and they're often very violating. They're often of an interpersonal, invasive nature. So for example, someone who has been exposed to child abuse and domestic violence and sexual violence within their family, all of those would be examples of these multiple events that could be causing that complex trauma. We also know that trauma is not an isolated experience. Like I just mentioned with a pandemic, a lot of people are experiencing trauma from this public health crisis. And everybody's trauma responses might look different, which I think is really important to acknowledge as well, that something that feels traumatic to you isn't always necessarily traumatic to someone else. So just acknowledging that also. And when we're making the shift to healing-centered engagement, there's a lot of different elements that could be part of that. I know that a lot of people earlier mentioned listening, someone mentioned breathing, and all of those show up in these different components. And I think empathy is really kind of the building block for healing-centered engagement. If you don't have empathy for the person that you're working with, it's really not healing-centered. So beginning by being vulnerable, open, and honest yourself, that can really encourage the people that you're working with to do the same if it's safe for them. I'm also seeing someone in the chat saying that two people can experience the same event and one of them could be traumatized and the other could be okay. It really depends on the support they received after the event mixed with their previous experiences. I think that brings up a good point as well, that if you're a helping professional, just not assuming how someone might respond to an event. We might all think that domestic violence is traumatic. For some individuals, that might not necessarily be the case, or they might be able to move forward from that event more easily than others might be, and it could depend on the support. Thank you for sharing that. I also think imagination is a really critical component of healing-centered engagement. Working with a survivor to dream up a different world, to dream up a different situation or a different life for themselves, and also acknowledging that they have the capacity to meet that imagination. And that really fosters a sense of hope, which I think is really vital after someone has experienced trauma, because oftentimes trauma can take that hope away. Reflection is another critical piece of healing-centered engagement. So examining, how are you responding to trauma? How is it impacting different facets of your life? And then figuring out what are the ways that you can start taking some of that power and control back. Which also I think is another reason why it's so important as helping professionals, not to push people into doing something they're not ready for. Calm. So someone earlier mentioned breathing. So are there different breathing exercises or meditation practices that you could bring into practice when you're working with a survivor? And then just also thinking about more generally self-care and compassion, both for yourself and survivors. And then also, I think it's really important, this piece of, if you're working with a survivor, not pushing them to share more than they're ready for at a given time. We all have different stages in our healing, and we know that healing isn't linear. So really making sure that you are allowing that survivor to control how much they're sharing of the trauma at any given time. So giving some of that power back. So now that we've looked at a couple of different elements of healing-centered engagement, we're curious in the chat if you could answer, how might you apply these elements to your life and your role as a helping professional? So for example, what does empathy or imagination look like in your work with survivors? So we'll take just a little bit of time in the chat here. So I'm starting to see some answers come in. So someone is sharing in the chat, being able to be open-minded, flexible, and understanding with clients who need different approaches to therapy, right? So recognizing that therapy is really not one size fits all. It can look different for everyone. Reflection might look like presenting as an empowerment tool to the client, right? Allowing someone to think of what they want instead of automatically giving them options or choices. So that empowerment piece, and I think that's also part of imagination. Someone is also sharing in the chat that they have clients journal what their happy space looks like, whether it's real or imagined. I really love that. I think especially for survivors who enjoy art or writing, that can be a really helpful imagination exercise. And then finally, I'm seeing in the chat, when your organization is creating studies or surveys, always give an option for prefer not to answer instead of making it mandatory. That's a great point. Open-minded, I'm seeing a couple of people say that, not being judgmental. I'm seeing a lot of imagination ideas here. So someone is sharing, they often ask a survivor if they could imagine a perfect day in the future. What does that day look like for them? Or having them write a letter to themselves as their imaginary friend. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. I think these are wonderful examples. And some of them I think are pretty easy exercises that you could integrate into your practice. Music therapy, right? So I think we'll go ahead and move forward, but some of these great ideas will continue coming into the chat. And so just briefly on this slide here, this is an example of one tool that you could potentially integrate into your practice. We aren't able to fit the entire tool onto the slide here. So when you get a copy of the slides, you'll be able to click on the link at the top right that says view the assessment. And so this is actually healing-centered organizational assessment. So there's a section about, what does healing-centered engagement look like for you as an individual? But overall, the assessment is really about what does a healing-centered organization look like? And so thinking about, are you at a red light where these things aren't really happening for you or your organization, or have you moved all the way to green light where some of these components really are already integrated in your organization? So I think this can be a helpful tool if you're trying to figure out how can I make the shift in my practice or my interactions with survivors from trauma-informed to healing-centered engagement. And then you'll see on the slide here, it kind of looks like a gingerbread cookie, but there's a handout here on the slide that's called the body outline. And this is an example of one tool that you could use if you are working with survivors, where you actually hand them this handout that shows the outline of someone's body, and you're asking them, what does resilience actually look like in your body? Are there places where you think resilience is located, and what does that look like? And so Brennison and I actually kind of made a visual example of what the body outline exercise could look like. If we were in person, we probably would have actually brought these handouts, and we would have taken a couple minutes for all of you to fill them out, but we just filled one out here. So thinking about on the hands, we put reaching out for support. That's really important to make sure that survivors are able to build the relationships that they need. Shoulders away from ears. And Brennison, please feel free to jump in because I know you filled out some of this too. Deep, calm belly breaths. So someone mentioned breathing earlier. That's the breathing exercise that you could do. Positive self-talk. At the feet, we put feeling grounded, engaging in movement. And I think that's also important to recognize that movement isn't just about, going to the gym and going on the treadmill. It could be dance, it could be going for a walk, walking with a friend, whatever that resilience looks like for you. And then on the head, we put focused and intentional. So focusing on responding versus reacting, which I think is really applicable to if you're working with survivors. Is there anything that you wanted to add, Brennison, or anyone else in the chat wanted to add anything about this exercise?
I think you did a great job. I really like the framing around feeling resilience, because I think, especially with the trauma-informed approach, we're focused so much on how is trauma stored in my body? How is my body keeping the score? And while all of those things are really important, the conversation sometimes stops there, where it's like, now I have all this awareness about the trauma that I'm carrying in my body, and I don't know how to shift it. And so that's where things like trauma sensitive yoga or other kind of body-based healing modalities come in to do more somatic experiencing and learning more about how to utilize, and not like, it sounds like a simple concept, but remembering that you have a body and being able to take agency in having a body and the different resources that your body contains to promote resiliency and healing. So I like that this is kind of used in this, what is right with you, the strengths-based approach. I think that's really in line with healing. And someone said, put something for the heart. So one thing that I was thinking of is self-compassion, of when we're able to extend compassion and kindness and patience toward ourselves. Maybe it's self-affirmations that could be located at the heart, or feeling really connected to our sense of purpose. That could be a tool for resiliency as well. Yes, okay, the compassion was well received. Okay, thank you so much. We'll move on to the next section, but if you think of anything, feel free to put it in the chat about how you experience resiliency in your body.
Thanks, Brennison. I also really like what you mentioned about kind of already having a lot of tools in your own body, that those really are resources that the survivor already has. So in this part, we'll shift more to talking about what are ways that someone's trauma reactions might actually play out in a helping setting. So what could that look like physically, emotionally, and then through their behavior? And please, everyone, if I miss something or there's something that you've noticed with survivors that I haven't mentioned, please feel free to put that in the chat throughout. So when we're thinking about how does trauma, or how could trauma impact someone physically, injuries, I think that's something that a lot of people think of right away, especially with things like domestic violence or child abuse. Headaches. We actually know that even for Different types of abuse that are not physical, like emotional abuse, there can be a connection there to migraines. That some people who experience emotional abuse or that chronic stress from abuse, they might be more likely to experience migraines. Insomnia, we also know that that can happen with domestic violence, for example, if your partner is depriving you of sleep. Chronic pain, that's something that a lot of survivors talk about, is really this ongoing pain and this ongoing stress. And again, we know that stress really impacts the body. Choking sensations, I think sometimes that can come up for some survivors who have been strangled, where they can kind of experience that sensation repeatedly after that traumatic incident. Or hyperventilating, gastrointestinal issues. So, for example, some survivors might experience ulcers or Crohn's disease, and a lot of that really goes back to that chronic stress. Or chest, back, and pelvic pain. There's also a lot of reproductive and sexual health concerns that might result from trauma, such as pregnancy complications. And substance use, which I noticed someone in the chat shared as well, that substance use can also be an impact of trauma. Physical ailments, right? And I think all of this is really important to acknowledge, because even if someone is not experiencing a traumatic event that is physical, like violence, it can still have a really significant impact on their body. Memory loss, yeah, thank you for sharing that one. Someone is also sharing, as a sex trafficking survivor, taking deep breaths has been so difficult, and pelvic floor dysfunction is an issue, right? So I think a lot of you are really touching on a lot of the things that are shared in the slide. Thank you everyone for sharing that. I know some of that was really personal. And when we think about the emotional impacts, and please feel free to share more of these in the chat, we know that depression and anxiety are unfortunately really common for people who've experienced trauma, as well as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And earlier when I mentioned complex trauma, or this exposure to multiple and varied types of trauma, we can also see complex PTSD. Suicidal ideation. Unfortunately, people who experience trauma have higher rates of suicide attempts as well. And then changes in self-esteem, I think, especially if you're experiencing repeated trauma, especially if it's of an interpersonal nature, that can really impact your self-image and how you view yourself, as well as loss of agency. And then someone had mentioned memory earlier. So memory loss, or just really struggling to remember things, I think can be a really common impact of trauma. I also think that the memory loss is just often not well understood. Sometimes survivors are asked, like, if they are reporting to law enforcement, why can't you remember these things? And sometimes that memory loss is viewed as this person is lying, or they're making things up, when in reality, people can't often remember a traumatic event. And it's very common to have that memory loss or that confusion. It doesn't mean that they're making anything up or lying. Hypervigilance, dissociating, right? So those are other emotional or physical impacts as well. And someone also shared in the chat, lack of family support and trauma can also play a huge role in further relationships, right? Thank you for sharing those.
Something that I noticed in the chat as well really segues us nicely to this next part about utilizing emotions as a healing tool. So someone in the chat wrote, for a traumatized person, joy and openness can be experienced in the body as similar to a threat. Acknowledging that healing and resilience may be incredibly uncomfortable as you re-enter your body. I think that is a really great point, and I really appreciate that you brought that up, because we do actually talk about joy as one of the fundamental emotions that can be experienced and have this role in healing. But as you mentioned, and we'll talk about this in the next slide too, joy, from Brené Brown, she kind of asserts that joy is the most vulnerable emotion that we can experience. And if you cannot tolerate joy, you start to dress rehearsing tragedy. So kind of expecting the worst thing to happen, like you're denying yourself of the ability to experience that joy. And so when something really blissful happens to someone who has a great capacity for joy, instead of using it as a warning to start practicing for disaster, which is something that a lot of people who have experienced trauma may automatically do, if saying, oh, things can't go too well for too long, like the other shoe always has to drop, that people who have this greater capacity for joy use it as a reminder to practice gratitude. And so you kind of can see how the role that joy can play in your healing journey can make it feel like living is worthwhile, and it might motivate us to seek more experiences of joy. The physical sensations, again, might feel opening. So that's something that was mentioned in the chat of openness can feel really scary because it might threaten our self-protective tools. So those are some physical sensations that you might have with joy. Others, anger. So again, some of these people, there's so many different emotions associated with experiencing and also healing from trauma. So sometimes it can be overwhelming, and some of us, we might just want to shut all of the emotions off. But being able to name our emotions and feel our emotions can really give way to creating these paths to healing. And I think that is something to be aware of, how we learn about other people's emotions. So especially if the trauma was interpersonal, I know there's a lot of survivors who never want to experience anger because that was something that was really scary that they observed in other people. But if we are able to take ownership of our own anger, it can help us change situations that might cause us fear or pain. So kind of using it as indicators and self-knowledge instead of something that can be dangerous or really unfamiliar. So kind of similar to the activity in the last few slides with the diagram of the person, these different emotions, they live in our bodies and they can present themselves in these different ways as you see on the screen. So we want to hear from you. We want to launch this poll about what emotions have played a significant role in your healing journey. And if that doesn't apply to you, you can answer the question for maybe clients that you work with and what emotions you think have played the significant role. And you're able to select more than one, of course. And then you have the option of writing in the chat if there's one that isn't listed on the options. Someone wrote in anxiety. Mm-hmm. All right, I'll give just about 10 more seconds. Seeing lots of responses all across the board for this one so far. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. So yeah, wow, it looks like all of these emotions are very significant. So 49% identified with joy, 46 with anger, 43 with sadness, 43 with love. I think kind of see in 41% with guilt. Yeah, I think that's a big one too. I think we hold such positive and negative associations and connotations with emotions that sometimes we can't take them at face value and think of like, what role is this playing, because we're so quick to label them as good or bad. And so I really appreciate getting more insight from people. Some people are including curiosity, dissociation, shame. So similarly to that, we have this concept of this emotional regulation system. So this is rooted in compassion-focused therapy. So the idea behind compassion-focused therapy is that it builds on this evolutionary ideas about the human brain and how it functions. So kind of the main person with CFT is Paul Gilbert. And so he talks about how the human brain is a product of evolution and how our thoughts, emotions, motivations, and behaviors can be understood in the ways that there's different advantages of all these different ways that we think, feel, acting, and how that posed for our ancestors and people who came before us. And so this model has kind of these three different systems that can be conceptualized as mindsets. So we have the drive, the soothing, and the threat. So people can be in states of threat. So this involves a mindset focused on seeking protection from dangers, which is a system that and a mindset that a lot of survivors of trauma exist in for a very prolonged period of time. So this system can be overactive, but the purpose of it, right, is threat detection and protection, of kind of having this mentality of, oh, better safe than sorry, you know. And so kind of tying that back to the last slide about emotions, if our threat system is overactive, that's when experiencing joy can feel really scary, because that might mean our guard is down and something bad can happen because we're not on high alert. And then another system, and again, you can kind of see all those arrows pointing back into each other because it all is very interconnected. So the drive has this mindset that's attuned to wanting, seeking, aspiring, or striving towards resources, all of these other things, to kind of be driven to promote movement, promote change, promote some kind of activity. But again, if we're kind of stuck in that threat system, it can be difficult to activate that drive system. And then one that I think is really rooted in healing-centered engagement is the soothing system. So healthy functioning of this soothing system is really necessary for self-soothing. Without the self-soothing kind of mechanisms, a lot of people can be prone to self-criticism, self-attack, and shame. And so this article from Psychology Tools, they talk about dysfunction can come about because of this limited flexibility or overuse of one system to the detriment of the others. So the idea is that all three of these will function together in unison to be able to promote a space for emotion regulation. And then it also talks about a less functional or less active soothing system can be a result of trauma, can be a result of neglect, or inadequate opportunities to learn soothing from important caregivers. So that can go all the way back to childhood, kind of that primary socialization environment. And also it makes me think about workplaces, right? If workplaces are not creating opportunities for us to engage our soothing system when we're always on threat or drive, I think that's something kind of at an organizational, systematic level that needs to kind of be evaluated. But this model helps to encourage people to develop a more compassionate mindset. So for me, I feel like understanding these three systems and how they operate in ourselves and also how they operate in the people that we support can be really helpful for us to know how not only trauma may be impacting our emotional regulation system, but also to identify strengths within each of these systems and opportunities to increase skill building to ultimately promote healing. So that was a lot of kind of word vomit, so thank you. And people are talking about vagus nerve engagement. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about polyvagal theory today. But thank you for your contributions. We're going to continue on to different types of responses here.
Thank you, Brennison. So here we're talking more about these behavioral responses, which I think some of you already shared some of these, and please continue to do so if you'd like. But the startle response, if someone hears or experiences something that reminds them of the trauma, for example, like a door slamming, someone yelling, kind of just that jolt, and you're put back in that situation where you experienced that trauma. Fidgeting a lot. One of the earlier slides mentioned that trauma can sometimes lead to just not being able to concentrate. So sometimes, people just might not really be able to focus on whatever is in front of them. Lack of eye contact. I think sometimes this comes up because it's difficult for people to establish trust with someone else after trauma. Also, sometimes with domestic violence, we see that the survivor's partner doesn't allow them to make eye contact with other people. So sometimes that response kind of lives on even after the relationship has ended, flinching. Like if someone gets too close to you, for example, substance use. A couple of people mentioned that earlier, that sometimes that is a coping mechanism for survivors of trauma. Being easily distracted, that kind of ties into not being able to concentrate. Feeling or acting on edge can be really consistent. For some survivors, it might be constant. And I think that really ties into what Brennison talked about with the threat system and the hypervigilance that someone mentioned earlier in the chat. Guilt. A lot of people in the chat shared guilt, that has been a really significant emotion that's impacted their healing journey. And sometimes guilt can really play into how do we view ourselves after trauma? How do we talk to ourselves? And sometimes the way that we talk to ourselves, we would never act that way towards someone else. We would never tell someone else the things that we tell ourselves. So making sure that we're extending that self-compassion as well. Sometimes trauma survivors also change the way that they dress. I'm thinking of sexual violence survivors who have this idea that maybe if I just change my clothing, that other people won't hurt me. And we know in reality, unfortunately, that it doesn't matter what you wear. But sometimes that's a response that some survivors have. Someone else is also saying in the chat, like engaging in different sexual behaviors that could be considered risky. That can be another behavioral response. Thanks for sharing that. So in the chat, we're interested in knowing a bit more about if you're supporting someone, whether it's a friend or maybe a client, and you were to observe the behaviors on the slide, what assumptions might you make about this person and how might that influence how you interact with them? So we'll take a little bit of time for the chat here. So someone wrote, speaking softly. Thank you. That could be another behavioral response. Making sure to remain non-judgmental if you're seeing some of these responses in someone. Someone else is also sharing, after leaving the game, I kept buying my kid toys and clothes and anything he asked for as a way to make up for not being present during their time trafficked. Behaviors can influence the way that survivors parent. Thank you. That's really important. I appreciate you sharing that. Personal space, right, that's something to think about. That's very important when you're interacting with people who've experienced trauma. Being aware of senses, sight, sound, smell, and sensory situations. I remember I was talking with someone a few years ago about, they work with survivors, and one of the things that they put into practice at their office location was that they made sure that every room that survivors would be in would have windows in it so that it wouldn't, contribute to that feeling of being trapped. So even just thinking about the physical environment is important. Someone else is sharing they're a hugger and they had to change and make sure to ask others if they want to be touched or not. Yeah, I think asking for that consent is really important. And that's also important with children as well. Someone else is sharing they work in a police department, so going into a soft interview room or meeting at a public space that isn't as intimidating, right? So going back to that physical environment, and then being calm, supportive, and compassionate. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing some of these strategies or these tips that you use when interacting with people who've experienced trauma. We can go ahead and move on to the next slide. And kind of tying into all of this is really the fact that the perfect survivor is a myth. Every person who experiences trauma is different. Their responses are different. How they view the incident is different. They might not fit this idea that some of us have about how they should behave. We know that some survivors of trauma, if it's domestic violence, they might continue a relationship with a person who harmed them. Maybe that relationship is sexual, maybe it's emotional, maybe it's romantic. They might engage in substance use, like many of you have shared as well, and sometimes that can be a coping mechanism. Someone also shared earlier, not everybody responds to an incident the same way. Sometimes people might not feel traumatized by an incident. They might not consider the incident to be traumatic. If they experience domestic violence, they might not consider it to be domestic violence. So acknowledging that as well. We also know a lot of survivors are sometimes criminalized as a result of abuse. So maybe they are engaging in some sort of self-defense behavior and they're criminalized for that. Maybe they're with an abusive partner and their partner coerces them into committing something that's against the law. So recognizing that survivors might be just as involved for that reason. And then we also know that in helping settings, kind of like I mentioned, sometimes people might be showing up or presenting as aggressive or angry. And that might not mean something about who they are as a person. That might be related to what they've experienced. We can move on to the next slide. I'm also seeing someone in the chat making sure to give survivors a heads up and what they might expect in advance. Yeah. So kind of just briefly on this slide, I did want to mention that sometimes with physical violence, that can lead to a traumatic brain injury, and that really can impact someone's behavior. So specifically, there's a connection between traumatic brain injuries and anxiety, depression, impulsivity, aggression, irritability, all of these different types of behaviors. A traumatic brain injury can affect how someone communicates with other people, how they feel, how they're managing their time, and it can also really cause sensory overload. So sometimes if you're working with a survivor who's, they're getting very frustrated, they can't concentrate, they're getting very irritable, just kind of trying to take a step back and think about, that could be a trauma response. It could also be the result of a health concern like a traumatic brain injury. We can go to the next slide. And then just briefly, we've acknowledged multiple times throughout, but everybody's trauma response looks different. And I think I'll just focus more on the diagram to the left that focuses on trauma responses. So I think a lot of people have heard about flight, fight, or freeze in these ways that people might respond to trauma, but not necessarily fawn. So fawning is actually another trauma response that goes into flight, fight, and freeze. And really what fawning is sometimes people refer to it as people pleasing. So someone, they might really want to appease whoever they're with. They'll do whatever their partner or someone else tells them to do. All of their time is spent on, is this other person in my life happy? Are they satisfied? And so the survivor's not really thinking about what they want and what they need. They don't have boundaries. Their identity is really tied up in someone else's or other people's identities. Because for them, fawning is really a way that they had to survive during the traumatic experience. And so they might reenact that in other relationships in their life. So just wanted to acknowledge that as well, that that's very common and it's not often talked about. And I think just for time purposes, we'll go ahead and move on to the next section.
So someone wrote in the chat about their experiences with police officers and refusing to take a statement at a church and stating that they needed a controlled environment, and that resulted in them physically forcing this person into the police station, wouldn't let this person leave, ripped their daughter from their arms, and after not signing their forms, they arrested me. And yeah, Maggie's expressing gratitude and condolences for having that experience. And I think that really highlights the importance of kind of this next section that we're talking about in terms of how important it is to create a warm and welcoming environment for survivors accessing helping services, because it's really not uncommon for systems that are supposed to be in place to support survivors and victims end up re-traumatizing or causing more harm or exacerbating the harm that was already caused to them. And unfortunately, that's the reality for a lot of people who have experienced trauma. And so as people who may be in helping roles, it can be really important for us to think about ways of creating this warm and welcoming environment and how much of a difference that makes for their experiences with navigating already very complex, complicated systems that don't always set up to be not only are they not trauma informed, but oftentimes they're really not healing centered and engaging those systems. And so just kind of being real about that and acknowledging a lot of work that different systems in place that are accessible to survivors need to improve. So I could talk about that for quite a while, but we'll instead move on to talking about the components of a safe, welcoming environment. So kind of back to that healing-centered engagement component of imagining, of like, what would we imagine would be like the ideal components of an environment that would cultivate healing? What does the physical space look like? So again, in that example earlier, talking about, it needs to be a controlled environment. Sometimes people think of it being very sterile. And as Meggie was mentioning before too, like a room that has no windows, has one door, and maybe you're not even able to face the door and see who's coming in and coming out. So what does the physical space look like? What might it smell like? What might it feel like? How are people experiencing the space? Those are things to consider. And what other considerations contribute to the possibility of healing from that physical environment component. So again, thinking back to your role, I know a lot of you identified as social service providers, and so that may not allow you to have this space that you would view as ideal of maybe having options for, essential oils, or having a room with like dim kind of soft lighting. Kind of thinking about that, you might not have the ability to influence those environments, but that might be at Women's Advocates. We have like a serenity room and different spaces for survivors to work with their advocates that are away from kind of the hustle and bustle, and have warm colors, warm textures, supportive things for them to be able to utilize in the physical space. So feel free to just kind of think about these components of different environments that you have been in that may have felt safe and welcoming for you, and kind of try to apply that to how you can integrate those things. Again, it can be a matter of that agency of, would you like coffee or tea? Like even allowing them to make these decisions and kind of experience different beverages and other things too. So there's a suggestion of a calming corner. So maybe even having a basket with some calming tools. I know that's something that's very common, especially with children these days, but I think it's something that can be applied across the lifespan of having these opportunities for comfort. So the basket could include noise canceling headphones, paper and crayons, fidgets, something soft to hold, some hard candies or mints, or even blankets. Yeah, those are really great suggestions. Yeah, sometimes too much stuff can be overwhelming. It can be overstimulating. So keeping it very simple and organized and easy to see everything that's in the space. So maybe calming quotes or sayings or pictures or things that can be looked at. I know like art can be very, very therapeutic. So having spaces to be able to engage with art or sit with art that might be painted on the walls. I know in Women's Advocates we have a sunset on one of our walls, so being able to look at that as well. Soft music, yeah. Thank you for contributing to these different components. rugs, tapestries, choices of seating, right? So not like you have to sit upright in this chair, like you can lay down, you can use this rug, you can use this blanket, and being able to kind of just meet the survivor where they're at. So kind of underscoring this need for understanding how the environment that we exist in is experienced by survivors and the people that we're supporting is this quote from Dr. Porges, who's the kind of founder of polyvagal theory. He talks about how we're wired for connection. And in order to help us survive, our bodies are designed and prepared for observing, processing, and responding to our environment. So that's why we thought it was important to include a dedicated section about the environment because of kind of reading our cues of danger in our environment. And that term, the name of kind of being able to do that, it's called neuroception. And so through the process of neuroception, we're experiencing the world in a way that we're kind of involuntarily, constantly, especially for trauma survivors, scanning situations and people to determine if they're safe or dangerous. So kind of it's this automatic process that happens within our neuroanatomy, which we don't have to get into that, but there are different parts of our brain that respond to cues of safety in our environment, in our interactions. So it can support feelings of physical safety and being safely emotionally connected to others in our social environment. And then there's other parts of our brain that can pull us away from connection, can pull us out of awareness and into this state of self-protection when we might be experiencing cues of danger, where we might result in shutting down, feeling frozen. And this all might be an indication that a certain part of our brain called the dorsal vagal nerve has taken over. So those are just some mechanisms of how the brain is involved in this process. It's not always a cognitive thinking process. It can be something that just kind of happens automatically. And I'm just going to take a peek at the chat. I saw a few people were sending in some messages as I was talking about that. So some people are sharing prior to COVID, this person facilitated a support group for female inmates in jail. Once a month, they had a therapy dog accompany them to the group, and the majority of the inmates absolutely love the animals and would pet the dog for a solid hour. Yeah, so about like kind of pet and animal therapy, being able to tune into that and have that be a component of the environment. Learning about how to validate and calm someone, how to respond to maybe if someone is experiencing constant breakdowns, how can you be present with that person and create an environment that promotes safety and trust and isn't constantly perpetually activating their threat system. So kind of related to this is affirmations and ways that we can celebrate healing. And so this is from the Vital Cycles Toolkit. So the source link is at the top of this link. So we didn't come up with these, but these are really great affirmations. And I really love the we and the our language of this because it takes that collective approach of it's not just you and it's you doing this and it's very individualized in terms of you are alone in this, but it's like it's a collective experience of promoting healing. So you can write some of these down if any of these really stand out to you. But these are just some affirmations that really celebrate healing. And so some that really stand out to me, I think, is our self-confidence and self-esteem strengthen as we learn to rely on our inner wisdom. So again, it comes back to like our bodies and our holistic selves already holding so much knowledge and wisdom and resources and tools for us to be able to lean on. Kind of that saying of everything that we need, we already have, it exists inside of us, but being able to be in conducive environments and connections with people that are able to make it feel safe to access them and utilize them. So if you think of any other phrases or anything you can think of that celebrates healing, we'd love to hear from them as well too. So for the sake of time, we'll move to applying different components of healing-centered engagement to your daily work. So a lot of you have already given examples of these, so I won't spend too much time on this, but some other suggestions and invitations that you might want to make to people that you're working with. So if you are thinking about engaging in empathy, maybe asking questions like, would you like to take a break before we talk about what happened? So that is more of an empathetic response instead of saying, we have to do this intake form, so you have to tell me everything that you've experienced. It's a part of the process. So kind of meeting this person with empathy. Again, imagination. So people mentioned a lot of different journaling. Another idea could be vision boards. So we've done that in our art group at the shelter, and that's been really a really fun, enjoyable time for our residents to be able to visualize what they want in their lives, and being able to make one and hold that, keep that in their room to kind of visualize what they're working toward and what they view as possible for their future. And then we also have reflection. So asking questions like, would it be helpful to learn more about your reactions to trauma and how you would like to respond in the future and what resources you might need moving forward? So calm. So you may have heard of box breathing. Sorry, I felt like I was going to sneeze. So there's another type of breathing called 4-7-8. So you're inhaling for 4 and you're kind of holding it at the top for 7 and exhaling for 8. So the idea behind that is that your exhales are longer than your inhales, which helps to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, or the rest and digest part of our nervous system. So that can help activate that soothing system that we were talking about earlier. And then for containing, so again, saying something like, it seems like this particular aspect of your experience really bothers you. Would it be helpful to write out a short, specific trauma narrative for it? So it's not saying you have to tell me everything, every detail, but if you're noticing and recognizing that there's something that a survivor that you're supporting feels really stuck on, that could be an opportunity to explore it further. And then care of like, what's in your self-care toolbox? Do you have designated times and ways to nurture your own needs? So those are ways of really being able to apply those different components of healing-centered engagement into your daily work. So these are just some more strategies to promote the dimension of emotional safety. So safety, if you've attended any of our webinars about safety, you would have heard us talk a lot about how it really goes beyond physical safety. And so these are different ways to promote emotional safety. And this was particularly from a toolkit for domestic violence shelters, but I think has applications for a lot of different working settings as well. So being able to say, we want you to know that whatever you're thinking, whatever you're feeling, you're welcome here. There's a lot of different expectations for existing in different spaces of how survivors should be presenting themselves, kind of going back to that myth of the model or the perfect survivor. So again, kind of helping them manage their feelings. That might sound like saying, for many survivors, this can be overwhelming. We don't have to solve every problem right away. Let's take the time to sort things out together and decide which thing you want to work on first. So again, back to that agency piece. Again, back to soothing. You may want to sit and relax for a bit. This room is set up for that, and it's open whenever you may need to use it. So that can be part of that calm aspect of healing-centered engagement. So there's a lot of different ways. And again, always including things of emotional safety for staff and the people who are holding this space is really, really huge too, because vicarious trauma and being exposed to trauma can kind of impact the way that helpers show up in their work too. So that is something that's really important to keep in mind if you are someone who holds a position of power to support people who work at your organization. Keeping that in mind is really important, and finding avenues to build that into their work to activate and access those systems can be important. So similarly, being able to honor survivors' whole selves. So kind of using this model of learning the different 8 dimensions, and there's probably even more than this too, of wellness. And so if you'd like to, you can think of strategies that you can implement in your own role and share them in the chat that would be used to promote maybe one or more dimensions of a survivor's wellness. So I know earlier people mentioned spiritual wellness, of being able to expand our sense of purpose and our meaning in life and maybe connection to something greater than ourselves. That can be really huge for people's healing journeys. So being able to think about all of these different aspects of their well-being, and how, again, a lot of times we focus on that physical. So when we're creating safety plans or doing other things, we're kind of focusing on, are you physically safe from being physically assaulted or harmed from someone? But physical, even that dimension can go beyond to referring to diet or sleep or nutrition or other aspects of that physical wellness as well. So just some things to think about here. And then similar, as we were talking about the polyvagal theory, talking about healing our nervous system to restore balance in our body. So this is kind of a activity that was promoted by the holistic psychologist. And so they kind of talk about choosing these different practices to focus on each day. So maybe keeping a journal of your practices and noticing and taking note of how your body feels and responds to deep belly breathing. So maybe even going on YouTube and looking up different guided meditations for that. Visualization meditation, connection, being able to co-regulate with other people, finding nature, that's a huge one too, of just being able to be outside, engage in physical grounding of like feeling sand or dirt on your toes, kind of connecting to the earth in that way. There's a lot of different ways of healing our nervous system to kind of restore that balance after experiencing a trauma. And then this final part is really discussing the empowering professional relationship. So that connection, so going beyond the environment and focusing on rebuilding that interpersonal connection. And so there's this quote by Judith Herman, who wrote Trauma and Recovery. And she writes that recovery is based upon the empowerment of the survivor and the creation of new connections. Recovery can take place only within the context of relationships. It cannot occur in isolation. So I think that that is something that is really important to think about when you're considering your role in someone's healing journey. So a prompt, again, you can share in the chat, or you can kind of just think about this to yourself. But we invite you to think about a time when you met someone for the first time and you just felt safe. And if you haven't experienced this, that's completely valid too. We don't want to assume that that's something everyone has experienced. But if you have experienced that, what do you think contributed to that feeling? How would you describe that person's energy? What did they say? What was their body language like? You know, there's some people that you kind of just meet and feel immediately connected to, or kind of feel this sense of rapport that you have known them for longer than you actually have. And so just kind of thinking about those different dynamics, and how you can maybe emulate those things in your own way, if you're thinking about someone that you just really felt safe with. So, you know, for me, even if we're kind of thinking about therapeutic settings, it's about, for me, I paid a lot of attention to language. So kind of the language that people use, if it's really invitational and I feel like this person is open-minded and non-judgmental and compassionate, and kind of the way that maybe if it's in person, they're kind of using eye contact, maybe they're feeling comfortable, even if someone looks cozy themselves. Like I've had a therapist who wrapped themselves in a blanket, and that felt really comforting to me because I could tell that they value their like kind of self-soothing, and that's something that I could engage in too and feel comfortable. Because I think sometimes in those therapeutic settings, we're like kind of performing and trying to present ourselves in a particular way, and that as someone in a helping role, you can really help set the tone for someone based on how you present to them and how you show up. So again, just kind of the language that you use. So some people are talking in the chat about feeling this sense of them being real, like being very authentic and not over professional or faking something. People are talking about eye contact, sense of humor. I think humor can be a really helpful tool for creating a safe environment. Active listening, feeling happy, having warm energy. Yeah, those are all really great components to think about. So when we're thinking about how healing takes place within relationship, we have some tips for providers and helpers who work with survivors. So kind of 6 different dimensions that are all really, I believe, to be rooted in this healing-centered engagement. But again, focusing what is right with the survivor, acknowledging that a lot of survivors experience self-esteem deterioration in an abusive relationship, and then how important it is for a helper to create a dynamic that explores, validates, and centers the survivor's strengths, because if they've been told for a really long time that they can't do anything right and that everything is wrong with them, and that kind of focusing on their deficits, that it can be really powerful to lean on the strengths that the survivor already has. Another thing that's really important, something for me that has come up in like thinking about trauma sensitive yoga, is acknowledging power dynamics. So thinking about how inherently in a helper helpee dynamic, there is someone who holds a position of power, and being able to actively work with survivors to solidify their roles, their expectations, and find ways to engage in non-coercion, and creating space for the survivor to reclaim their agency in this space can be really important. So it's not denying that there are power dynamics, because inherently there may be, but it's being able to name them and work with the survivor on how would it feel to have a sense of shared power. And then authentic connection. So that was something that was mentioned in the chat, of the importance of being able to embrace the commonality that we're both complex, nuanced human beings, and being able to make space to bond with things outside of their traumatic experiences. So maybe going beyond building rapport into focusing on the importance of feeling seen, feeling heard, and respected as someone currently is. So just kind of as they are in this present moment, not where they need to be, not where they have been, but where they are in the present moment. Similarly, being able to honor the survivor's story. So a huge part of this is avoiding making assumptions. So creating space for survivors to share parts of their experiences as they feel comfortable and safe to, meeting their sharing with compassion. If they're interested in like supporting survivors with writing their own trauma narrative, there is a resource. If you kind of type in trauma narratives, there's ways that helpers can kind of hold that space for them to, if writing is a tool for healing and self-expression, that's a way to kind of honor their stories too. And then the next one is kind of meeting the survivor where they're at. So again, many helpers might have a vision for where they want their client to be. So while setting goals and moving forward is definitely an important piece of the puzzle, being with a survivor in their current state is where the work will actually begin. And then lastly, defining what survivor-focused and survivor-driven healing means. Kind of thinking about how you may be the co-pilot, but the survivor is kind of flying the metaphorical plane on their healing journey. So creating a balance between helping the survivor build their tool belt of resources, and also asking the survivor what their needs are and how they wish to fulfill them. So that was something that was mentioned before too. Another person is mentioning food in the chat. Making or sharing a meal together can be great for healing and engaging multiple senses. Yeah, kind of just thinking about your own scope of practice and what your boundaries are. If being able to integrate food, and that can be something where you integrate culture too, can be a really healing experience too. And then lastly, we wanted to provide this tool again from that Vital Cycles toolkit. It all has arrows pointing back to the survivor's own inner wisdom. So these are all different paths, and it's not a straight line, of course, right? So like healing is not linear. So you can be on different paths at any time. You may feel like, wow, I'm really at a point in my life where I feel safety. And so I'm in a stabilizing path, or maybe I'm in a connecting path where I really want to nurture my relationships after maybe being isolated from my family and my friends for so long. Harmonizing, being able to meet our needs in progressively healthier ways, affirming. So if you'd like to write in the chat, you can identify with a particular path on the screen. Or you can recognize what path you think most survivors are on when you start to work with them. That can be helpful to learn more about that. And then how we can meet ourselves and others where we're currently at on these journeys, knowing that we can be at different parts of these kind of steps at different times. So I know there's a lot of different paths on the screen. You can let us know if any stand out to you. I think for me, where I am right now is kind of recharging. I feel like I've been, especially with the seasons changing and everything, I personally have been in a recharging path of kind of resting and renewing to kind of focus on being able to create space for healing and enjoying life. Meggie, is there a path on the screen that's standing out to you and speaking to you today?
I think for me right now, learning is the big one. I feel like every day I'm learning more and more about even just how past experiences have affected me, and things are coming up every single day, and also just recognizing that learning is lifelong, and no matter what age you are, that's always something that's very present. So just recognizing that I'll never know everything about myself, and that's okay. I think that's the path I'm on.
Seeing in the chat, someone saying flowing, so compassionately allowing our emotions to flow. Another person in the chat identified with harmonizing, so meeting our needs in progressively healthier ways. Another person related to processing, so transforming traumatic memories and relieving us of their burdens. Absolutely. Kind of flowing and feeling a sense of not using substances to numb. Another person identified with embracing. Great, thank you so much. And that is a really great resource. If you do want to click on the link on the slide, there's a lot of other great resources on that link in that toolkit. So as always, we have a lot of resources available. So we have Violence Free Minnesota's website, Women's Advocates website, and our 24-hour crisis line. We also have a 24-hour chat. And if you are located in Minnesota, we do have something called pop-up advocacy at the Rondo Library on Tuesdays from 11 a.m. to 3. We'll include more information about that in the follow-up email. And then further reading. So these are some of the main kind of toolkits that we've talked about throughout the presentation. And then if you would like these slides, we will include a link to them. You won't get that. Our programs assistant doesn't work on Fridays. So you'll receive a follow-up email on Monday. But if you are really eager to have the slides, you can scan the QR code and it'll download a copy of the PowerPoint slides in PDF form. So we just wanted to extend a lot of gratitude to you all for being here today. When you close out of the webinar, the survey should pop up. If it doesn't, I put it in the chat. Again, it will be in that follow-up email. The recording will be on our YouTube channel on Monday. So you'll be able to access that using the link that I just sent in the chat. And if you are looking for a certificate of attendance, I put the instructions for how to request that in the chat here too.
Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate your time today.
Yes, thank you. So I'll leave this up for just one more minute. If you're grabbing the slides by using the QR code or jotting down any of our contact information. We also have, we're very active on social media, so we would love for you to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, like our page, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have a lot of really great resources and information to kind of fill your feed with helpful, positive affirmations and resources and things of that nature too. So we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and weekend, and you do something that helps cultivate more joy and healing in your life. And we hope to see you at a next webinar. Our next webinar coming up will be next week. And sorry, 2 weeks from now. It's Monday, November 29th. It's on coercive control. So I'm going to include the sign up link for that. It's going to be presented by our very own Mary Beth. And it's on coercive control. So it is officially 11:30 on my clock. So I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. But thank you again so much and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Bye.